This episode of Books and Boba is brought to you by the new Netflix original series, The Brother's Son, a fun, slick, action-packed crime drama starring Michelle Yeoh in her first leading role since winning the Oscar for Everything Everywhere All at Once, and featuring all Asian talents both in front of and behind the camera. When the head of a powerful Taiwanese triad is shot by a mysterious assassin, his eldest son, legendary killer Charles Chairleg's son, heads to Los Angeles to protect his mother Eileen and his naive younger brother Bruce, who's been completely sheltered from the truth of his family until now. But as Taipei's deadliest societies and a new rising faction go head-to-head for dominance, Charles, Bruce, and their mother must heal the wounds caused by their separation and figure out what brotherhood and family truly mean before one of their countless enemies kills them all. Taking place in the San Gabriel Valley, the epicenter of Asian American culture, The Brother's Son is a high-octane family drama with top-notch action choreography and an Asian American heart. Watch The Brother's Son now only on Netflix.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And welcome to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here for an author chat with Aube Lescure about her debut novel, River East, River West, a coming-of-age story about the daughter of an expat living in mid-2000s Shanghai. As always, the Books and Boba podcast is listener-supported at patreon.com/booksandboba, where if you support us as a patron, you get access to our members-only Discord server, where we chat with each other in real time, as well as our monthly bonus podcast episode, Boba Chats, where Rira, myself, and a guest have fun conversations about all things books and otherwise.
Yeah, so we had a really great conversation with Aube. Her background is super interesting because she grew up in Shanghai and went to a Chinese public school and also a Chinese international school. So it was really nice to hear about her experience growing up. And I really enjoyed reading this book. I knew that this was going to be Marvin's jam once I read the synopsis for it. So yeah, it was... It was great talking to Aube.
Yeah, we read a lot of coming-of-age stories on this podcast, specifically stories about children of immigrants. So it was fun to read a story that kind of flips that on its head and tells us the experience of a child of an expat living in China. So had a great chat with Aube about her inspirations for her stories, her setting, as well as her character. So yeah, please enjoy our conversation with Aube Lescure.
And we are here with author Aube Lescure. She is a French-Chinese American writer, and her debut novel, River East, River West, came out earlier this month. Welcome to the show, Aube.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. A legendary show with legendary hosts.
Oh my goodness. That's a lot of pressure.
That's never been told to us in our face before. Thank you. We appreciate being legendary in your mind.
So we like to start our show by asking our authors, how they became a writer. Were you always a writer? Did storytelling come to you naturally, or was it something that came to you later in life?
I was always a rabid consumer of stories, whether it be books that my mom and I would buy at secondhand bookstores in Shanghai when I was growing up, or in the form of DVDs and movies and TV shows that growing up in China, I had a very easy access to in sometimes not quite legal forms, but I feel like that was a huge part of kind of my media consumption diet growing up. And I always knew I loved reading and writing, but I think like many people, it didn't seem like a viable career path, mostly in terms of financial stability, especially when I was in college and graduating from college. I actually studied political science, and that's the field I wanted to go into when I thought writing is always something I can do on the side or later in life. And it took one day at the office at this think tank I joined post-graduation. And everyone there was so excited about statistics and running regressions. And I was like, wait a minute. If this is what poli-sci research actually looks like in real life, I am not cut out for it. And I saved up my salary from that year in DC and started traveling and writing and keeping my overhead costs really low by traveling and kind of living on my savings. And that helped me to kind of softly make the leap from, being a scared college grad, not knowing how I was going to pay rent, to becoming kind of an Airbnb hostel hopping backpacker who was, I was, 21 at the time. And then I started writing kind of freelance articles. I started translating subtitles for TV shows, for Netflix. It somehow always circles back into TV shows and movies. And then became gradually over the years a full-time freelance writer and editor. I found a job I love at a magazine called Off Assignment, where I'm editor, and I have been for the past 4 years. And it's part-time, but I feel like that's kind of the cornerstone of my writing life and writing community. In real life, I also found that in Boston, where I've been living for the past few years, there's a wonderful writing organization there. And I never did an MFA, never did grad school, but they do have a year-long novel revision program, which I think is quite rare to be able to workshop your full novel with 10 other people. And it's really thanks to that I was able to write this book, complete it, have the discipline and accountability. And then that brings me to where I am today. The book just came out, I think, 2 weeks ago. So it's been a wild time.
Yeah, congratulations. I mean, I have two comments to your story. First is just flashbacks from, I think, every Chinese kid who used to go back, to Asia during summers or had parents travel back and forth. We have that binder full of bootleg DVDs of movies that may not be out on DVD yet.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely, I don't know if that was a Korean pastime as well, to bring back burned DVDs of
I mean, we had our
movies.
corner video stores with their VHS tapes. I'm sure we had DVDs later on, but yeah.
Yeah. And second, which is, I guess I feel bad because it is such a basic question for our Asian American authors, but you mentioned leaving your DC think tank job to go travel around, staying in hostels, Airbnbs. How did your parents take that?
My parents were pretty checked out of trying to control me at that point. I actually grew up with my mom for most of my childhood, and she was a single mom. My mom's French and my dad is Chinese, but my mom was a lifelong expat in China, and she raised me there. And I think I actually really take after her in terms of this willingness to just, get up and leave and move and kind of have a very itinerant kind of lifestyle. She never owned a house, or we rented apartments, year to year. And oftentimes we would just move across Shanghai just because a lease was up and maybe there was a better deal somewhere else. So I feel like she actually modeled this kind of acceptance of just a very kind of unrooted lifestyle. So she could offer no criticism. It would not be accepted.
That's awesome. I feel like it's something that a lot of us wish we could have done, but we were just too either scared of the uncertainty or scared of our parents' judgment if we were to do something like that. So that's really cool. Those experiences definitely, you can see those come through in your book.
My book is very. It's no secret that it's quite autobiographical, at least in part. And the mom in it is not French, because that would be, I think, just very confusing to write a book in English. Yeah, and it's too close. It's way too close, but it's largely about, a single mom and her biracial teenage daughter living in Shanghai, kind of drifting around, and at least before the story starts. So there's definitely some parallels there.
So I know that you developed your book in the Grub Streets novel incubator class. How was your drafting experience, and what were some of the most important lessons you took away as a writer?
Mm, I applied to the program. It was a really, really messy first draft. And they want you to have a full book to apply and get in, but I think that they're quite tolerant about the fact that it's probably going to be a mess, and the whole point of the program is to kind of get feedback and rework it. So I had my main storyline with my teenage protagonist Alva, mostly written at the time, and she was my only narrator in my early vision of the book because it was so autobiographical. And to be honest, I'm really not a very imaginative writer. I would say I'm a nonfiction writer primarily. I love essays. I love personal essays. I found it to be such a huge struggle to learn to invent story arcs and invent scenes. So in the very end, I kind of learned how to become a fiction writer through the process of writing this book. But at first, I just had a very kind of autobiographical, very close to my real experience kind of draft, along with just some random experimental fragments from different points of view. So we had a bit of Alva's mom. We had a bit from her Chinese classmates. I had a whole section set at an internet rehabilitation camp in central China. And my workshop mates, the single most important and major contribution they made earlier on the process, after reading the book, they asked, we see you're experimenting with all these other voices and POVs, but why are we not hearing from Alva's stepfather, this man called Lu Feng, who is a Chinese businessman and the landlord that her mother marries kind of out of nowhere, all of a sudden at the beginning of the book. And it feels like my classmates thought he was in some ways kind of the beating heart of the novel, and his relationship to Alva was one of the, major through lines. And how strange it was that I hadn't, I was kind of circling around him, but hadn't really dived into his POV. So then thanks to that feedback, and with the second they said it, I was like, yes, absolutely. There's something there. And in fact, I know his whole story in my head. I can see all the ways in which it not only intersects with the present storyline, but it provides a whole other context to it. And that's when I decided to write a secondary timeline and point of view from Lu Feng, this Chinese stepfather's perspective. And the book became a very different book when you have, two narrators. I think something I learned is that readers will tend to like one over the other. And that's just kind of okay. Like you cannot, it's kind of like a fun personality test hearing, which storyline a reader gravitated towards more. And it's just nearly impossible to force someone to like both equally. So it's kind of a risk having those two POVs. But my hope is that they interplay off each other and juxtapose in a very interesting way. And Alva's timeline is so short. It's just 1 year, 2007 to 2008. And then Lu Feng's timeline spans decades from 1985 until it converges to the present moment. So I had a lot of fun during this novel revision program playing with constructing that structure.
Yeah, I think the thing with dual narratives is just you get so invested in one story and then you swap over and they're both cool, but it's like, oh, that ended in a cliffhanger. Should I just skip to the next part when they come back? But yeah, I imagine it's a challenge, but yeah, I mean, I think it worked well in your book. Speaking of your book, can you give our readers a quick synopsis of River East, River West?
Yes, absolutely. It's a coming of age / family drama / social novel that takes place entirely in China. And it follows a biracial teenage girl called Alva, who is growing up with her expat single mom in Shanghai, who out of nowhere marries their Chinese landlord. And they're all forced to now live together in this apartment. And Alva sees this marriage is very transactional, and she starts thinking about what she can get out of this new situation. And she's obsessed with watching American movies and American media. And if she can't go to the US because she's only 14, she wants to get as close to the US inside China as possible. So she finds her way to the Shanghai American School and discovers a way seedier and less pleasant world there than she had imagined. And the secondary narrator of the story is Lu Fang, the Chinese stepfather. And we go back to 1985 when China was just reopening up its borders during the Reform and Opening era, when the first waves of foreigners were coming in. And we find out that Lu Fang and Alva's American mother, Sloane, have a story, a complicated love story, maybe love story, that goes back much further than Alva imagined.
Yeah. I mean, so we read a lot of Asian American literature on this podcast, right? That's kind of our thing. And, the child of immigrant storyline is not something that's unfamiliar to us. But your novel seems to are like an inversion of that, right? An inversion of what we're used to seeing, which is like, it's a child of immigrant story, but a child of an immigrant in another country, right?
Mm-hmm.
An expat in China. So, you mentioned that, this was loosely based on your own experiences, but what drew you to, want to tell a story about a child of immigrants in Shanghai?
I think it's so interesting that you use the word inversion, because also it's so hard to know how to describe this novel in the vein of immigrant story, not immigrant story. I've also tried calling it kind of a reverse of the traditional kind of East to West English language immigrant story that probably you guys feature a lot on this podcast. And the reason I couldn't write that kind of an immigrant story, even though I love reading them, is I'm just not very imaginative, and I've never experienced that. That's not my personal experience. My parents never immigrated to the US. Actually, I came here by myself when I was 16 for schooling, and then stayed ever since. But I just never had the experience of growing up in the US. But I did have the experience of growing up in northern China and Shanghai with an American expat mom. And I feel like for me, I wouldn't call the character in my novel an immigrant. I would say definitely she's more of an expatriate. And I've thought a lot about the distinction between immigrant and expatriate. And I think in China, what's interesting, that immigration to China, even to this day, is a very tricky thing to describe. I feel like there's a lot of workers and laborers who maybe come from South Asia or Southeast Asia who can truly be considered immigrants to China because they are working and really staying long-term in the country. And for expats, for Western expats who have come to China, I feel like there's always kind of this assumption of transience. Like, sure, there might be working and living here and even raising their children here. It seems to be pretty rooted, but there's no true assumption that they're going to stay in China in the real long term, that their children are going to stay here, that they are going to raise, more generations of the family there. At least when I was growing up in Shanghai, the expat relocation package was a big thing. A lot of expats were in town because their multinational companies, send them to China, and to incentivize the move, basically provided really cushy relocation packages, which entailed living basically in these gated communities and villas and having chauffeurs and maids and service staff. And I kind of grew up in between that. Like, my mom wasn't a corporate expat. She kind of more of a renegade. Like, I love China. I want to raise my child there, but I don't want to be part of the privileged expat community. And I wanted to write a book that was not just about expatriation and expats, but rather about the impact that kind of flow of population has on Chinese characters or, mixed race Chinese characters. So it really mattered to me that it wasn't an expat story as much as a story about expats and the impact of their presence on, local Chinese people and characters. Because to be frank, I kind of wrote this book as an anti-expat takedown. At first, I was like, there's no books kind of calling out the amount of indifference and condescension that was just so pervasive in a lot of the expat attitudes and communities that I saw and witnessed growing up. If there were books or TV shows, I feel like they kind of focus on like the thrilling, wild, like glamorous Asian metropolis kind of lives they led.
Yeah,
and I wanted
like the
to write
Pray
some
love story, right? Like
Yeah.
exploring this exotic place and learning about myself.
Yes.
And you can swap the cities too when it comes to like expat communities because it's such a bubble and they don't really venture out that much in that bubble. So I feel like a lot of novels where it does follow an expat, I don't know, it just kind of, the cities kind of seem interchangeable.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's kind of a real indicator of just how big of a bubble these expat communities can live in and the extent to which their interactions with the local people or the local societies oftentimes take the form of, like service industry transactions. Like the majority of Chinese people expats in Shanghai interact with are their staff or their employees. And there was just this, so I didn't even, hear or really use the word local growing up. And I only started hearing it and this kind of curious tint it had in expats' mouths. And when I started attending an international school for 2 years when I was in high school, I was in the Chinese public school system before. And, no one was saying locals. It was just like, oh, like, yeah, everyone's here, Chinese, Shanghainese. And then I remember being shocked as a teenager hearing expats teens or expats, you say things like, oh, we don't want to go there. That's a local bar. Was the insinuation that it was not cool enough because it was local or that the glamour to see and be seen really was only worthwhile in places where there were other expats. And it's almost like, the Chinese people in the city that they were inhabiting were just backdrop or as, you were saying, interchangeable backdrop. And I thought I really wanted to write a book that called that out in some ways or really shone the spotlight on Chinese or, biracial characters and how they were reacting to that infiltration of both, Western media, Western influence, and like physical presence of Westerners.
Yeah, I mean, Shanghai has been it's a very cosmopolitan city, and it's a place that's been influenced by like there's so many imperial powers, often at the same time, right, throughout its history. As someone who grew up there, like what were some aspects of living there that was really important for you to capture in your book?
I feel like I really wanted to capture in one sense, the kind of sweet details of a Chinese childhood. And, I have a foreign passport and I had a foreign mother and, I was clearly not a fully Chinese school child in terms of, my status or passport, but going to Chinese public school for 8 years, just the small quirks of a Chinese childhood, like wearing the uniform and red kerchief to school every single day, doing kind of the morning exercises, the flag raising ceremonies, some of the kind of ludicrous, ridiculous things we were learning about in our textbooks. And also, I love Family Mart. Like Family Mart is, this ubiquitous kind of 7-Eleven equivalent that's everywhere in Shanghai. It was really important to me to have these like homages to Family Mart throughout my book and the snacks that students would buy after school. Like I think I wanted to bring that granularity of Chinese schooling and a childhood in China to life. And also as, Alva kind of pivots into the expat world, I did want to capture this genuine sense of thrill that the big city represented, that I think even, as a child or as a teenager there's almost no going back. It's like no city will be like Shanghai, like having that level of kind of just like magic and infinite possibilities in the air, in the sense that, everything is constantly changing. There's so much to explore. There's just such an electricity in the air in a city like Shanghai. I think that's what draws a lot of, expats who are like, this is my, like, yes, eat, pray, love, but also like Sin City, like Vegas version of, like, yes, this is a cool city in Asia. I think that drew a lot of foreigners and still does. But growing up there as a teenager, having that, I felt spoiled. And now, yes, I'm looking, Boston is not it. It's like, it's nothing can reach that level of kind of electricity. I'm calling you guys from New York now because I'm doing a book event here. And I feel like that's maybe the only comparison. But yeah, it's like a big city childhood that really, really, it's like in my DNA.
Yeah, what I found fascinating about your book was how you showed that granularity of Chinese quote unquote local schools, and also just the contrast between Chinese school and international schools. They have their quirks, they're very unique in their own ways, but at the same time, they teach history from a very biased viewpoint. Can you tell us more about your experience, like going from one world to the next and just kind of navigating your identity in those two school systems?
Yeah, I so you may remember from earlier on in the book, Alva gives a real example of a question that was on her history test, which asked why did the Japanese capitulate during World War II? And the answers were like the American atomic bombs, A, the American atomic bombs, B, threat of a Soviet land invasion, C, the relentless courage of the Chinese Communist Party, and D, all of the above. And this was a real question on a history test I took. And I was like, oh, D, all of the above, of course, like kind of silly that, C is part of it, but of course it is. And I got that answer wrong, and I got points taken off on the test because it was C and C only. The only correct answer was the relentless courage of the Chinese Communist Party, which I guess, being a good Chinese school child, that still burns. And I was like, I need to get those points back one way or another. So I featured that multiple choice in my book. But that's kind of representative, I think, of, some of the very propagandic elements that were in our Chinese and history classes. And I think, in terms of identity, for me, I was an angsty teenager, so I was kind of mad about it in a way that my Chinese classmates weren't or would roll their eyes at. Like, it wasn't I stumbled upon this great big secret that some of the stuff we were being taught, were kind of nationalistic or propagandic, but I was really kind of riled up against the institution of like, how dare they, impose this on us. And then the school kind of stress and test prep really got worse and worse and worse as, we approached Zhongkao, a major exam to get into high school. And I feel like the one people talk about more is, Gaokao, to get into college. Like, it really becomes kind of a crushing level of schoolwork. And I think as we approach the Zhongkao exam, it became clear to me that I had this out all along that my Chinese classmates didn't have. I feel like that was a major moment of a reality check about my identity. Was I could, complain all day and be really depressed about the schoolwork and our kind of the crushing weight of our daily lives, but I could get out once it became too much. What actually happened was I told my mom, hey, I'm an eighth grader, but I'm actually just depressed going to school. Like, there's no joy in it. This is just so crushing. And she said, okay, well, now it's true that you have options. You can go abroad for high school or university. So if it's too much for you now, we can look at international schools. And my Chinese classmates did not, they did not have that same out and those same options nearly as easily. So I think that was a moment where I was like, first truly realizing the kind of forking paths in lives that, I had access to. And then international school, my mom could not afford the big fancy ones like the Shanghai American School or the British school because they are so expensive and they don't give out financial aid. Because why? Because the companies are, paying for the expat kids anyways. So I went to the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation's employee school. It was like a semiconductor Taiwanese company that had opened this kind of budget international school. So I went there for 2 years and I played soccer, which is how I got to travel around to the other much fancier schools and kind of, that opened my eyes to expat adolescence in Shanghai. And I think in terms of the stuff we were learning, I remember in English class, we were reading A Passage to India and Empire of the Sun, these novels, kind of, really colonial era novels set in Asia. And there was very little talk of, hey, the expat life that we are living in right now kind of models, in these novels, people only really interact with local people as their staff, and they're living in, villas and gated communities and going to international school and have all this help and privilege. And we were, talking about colonialism in those novels, but the expat life all around us still looked pretty much the exact same, but there was, very little acknowledgement of it. So I think that also, it inspired me to really highlight those aspects in contemporary China in my book.
Yeah, that's definitely some dissonance there. Because for us too, in the States, when we were growing up, those are probably the only books that even reference Asia that we were assigned to read too. So it's kind of interesting that those are also the books that are assigning you to read while you're already there.
Yeah. I think the idea was these are cool books because we're kind of, we're living in Shanghai and we're foreigners. But there was, again, back in this would be around 2008, 2009. I just don't think there was the level of, cultural impetus and awareness and discussion around privilege or neo-colonialism that I don't think it would really occur to the teachers to make those parallels. But now in hindsight, I really see them.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that you're half of your book is set in 2007, 2008, I was taken aback as a reader because we've read books where a lot of the times Shanghai is set during the Cultural Revolution or the Great Cultural Leap. But I'm reading it, I'm like, Game Boy, I Am Legend. These are contemporary things that I remember from my youth, but it's in a modern Chinese setting. And it just kind of took me aback because I'm like, oh yeah, the China that I'm used to seeing in literature, it's kind of the old China. We don't really see modern China. And I just want to ask you, how did you go about having your characters navigate and reinvent themselves as China also reinvents themselves?
I really love that you picked up on those little cultural details, because I do think that most English language literature that exists about Shanghai is either very genre, noir, triad novels, or historical fiction, the glamorous kind of Art Deco colonial era, 1920s glamorous Shanghai. And I wanted to write a book where there would be this kind of maybe offbeatness and uncanniness to readers, where it's oh, this is just the granular teenage life with very similar cultural references, but it's in a country where maybe a lot of readers have never set foot in, or they're not familiar with that kind of childhood or adolescence. And yet what I was hoping to do was remove the sense of like filtering or translation or mediation when we read about, childhoods in countries we've never visited. There can be this sense of a certain remove, like, oh, I'm reading about someone's upbringing in a foreign country. And it's kind of hard to express how I attempted to do that. I think it's by aggressively including just so many kind of little details that were true of, whatever was being released on the internet or happening circa 2007, 2008. I kind of wanted to bring that verisimilitude in of the kind of global reach of media and how there was just so many common threads to all of our adolescences. And yeah, in terms of the characters reinventing themselves as China reinvents itself, I think I chose 2007, 2008 as the particular year most of the action is set in, because it was the year of the Beijing Olympics, which in China was kind of seen as the year when China would have its like debutante ball on the world stage and be like, behold, we are, we have risen, we are so powerful, and this is kind of the golden height of our glory. Was a really big moment in China, but unexpectedly, just a few months before, the Wenchuan earthquakes in Sichuan happened, which was this major, devastating natural disaster that also kind of really shook the nation to its core. And a few months after the Beijing Olympics, we had the global financial crisis, which, of course, affected China, but also in a major way affected the expat community in China, because all the aforementioned fancy expat relocation packages, a lot of them just disappeared overnight, and companies were pulling people out of the country. It was a massive exodus. They no longer had the villas, no longer had the international schools. They had to go back home and no longer have access to this glitzy life that was always kind of a timeshare in some ways to begin with. So I think I really wanted to have those kind of major geopolitical kind of like current event landscape as a backdrop. Although I will say, learning, how to write a novel, they're more in the backdrop than I'd hoped, because I learned that I had to center the story and the characters and their development first and foremost. I had like pages and pages and pages on the Beijing Olympics, and now I think there's just like one discussion or one line alluding to the fact that it was on TV. But I hope that kind of the energy of 2008, which is such like it feels like historical fiction now. I feel like it was like yesterday, but I guess we must admit that it was well over a decade ago. But there was like a particular energy to China at that time I wanted to capture. I couldn't write about current day China. I feel like it's changed so much.
It's so different now. Yeah.
It's so different. Yeah. It's like a tech, kind of like a vaguely tech dystopian vibes every time I go back. Like I went to my local supermarket a few years ago. This was pre-COVID, and they like scan my face to deduct money from my WeChat account, and that's how like you could pay for groceries. And that just blew my mind. I was like, that
sounds terrifying.
Right. So I feel like to write a true contemporary novel about current day China, I would need to live there for like 5 years to truly, appreciate and observe like all these bizarre details that every time I go back, there's just a new surprise. It's like a Black Mirror episode happening over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, so your story follows your main character, Alva, as she, it's her coming of age story, but she's entering her like teenage rebellious years, right? And it was really cool to see what teenage rebellion looks like, in other countries, right? Like countries where, they might not check IDs because drinking age is 18 and people who work at convenience stores don't really care. And she does a lot of rebellious things. How much of that was, drawn from your own experience, and how much that was something that you've drawn from like either friends or stories that you've heard?
Yeah. Did you ever dye your hair blonde?
No, I didn't dye my hair blonde, but when I first went to international school, I did dye it red, and it was bad. It was a bad look. Yeah, I think I did want to capture some ways in which teenage rebellion happened in China at the time that maybe most people, unless they live there, don't really know. So, cyber cafes and KTVs, which are basically these, karaoke halls. They were like two really big, and malls also, were really big features of kind of teenage, like, I guess, like outlets for like pressure and release for Chinese students. But I didn't know personally, Chinese classmates who went out and, like drank and went clubbing. That was kind of exclusively expat teens doing that. And I think race definitely plays a huge element in that. I don't think a nightclub bouncer would see a Chinese teenager and just let them in. But you have a pack of, 15 expat girls show up and it's like, oh, sure, there's no ID. Here are some open bar VIP, tickets, and you guys go on in. And it was really shocking the extent to which nightlife played a big role in, expat teens' lives with no real oversight or rules or protections at the time. And thankfully, a lot of the bad things or reckless things that happen in the novel did not happen to me personally, but in hindsight, there were 1,001 opportunities for danger and disaster and real consequences to just being so young and just being set loose in such a big city and almost allowed to or incited to do a lot of these dangerous things. And in writing the novel, there was a lot of exploring the what ifs, like what if someone wasn't watching, and what if this did happen, or what if this sequence went to its logical conclusion, which would be really horrifying. And some of it did happen to people who I knew or things I'd heard about. But yeah, thankfully, I emerged relatively unscathed from a lot of those dangerous experiences. But now that I'm 30, looking back at that, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I would never let my child, anywhere near those, I guess calling them opportunities is weird, but yeah, that kind of life where
the situation,
yeah, situations where like absentee parents or just absentee kind of like institutions, like I think absentee parents were also a big feature of that adolescence I was trying to describe.
Speaking of parents and expats wielding privilege, like being able to go to bars without having their IDs checked, Sloane is an interesting character. Sloane being Alba's mother. She's a foreigner and she has a disdain for the expat community, but at the same time, she's not above wielding her privilege when it benefits her. Can you tell us about like how you went about crafting her character?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really wanted to play out a psychological experiment of what if a really kind of plain, mediocre, average white woman who's, all of those things in her home country came to China and felt so special and so receive, so much attention that she grows addicted to it to a point where her life becomes a kind of endless performance or attempt to accrue more and more of that attention, because here in China, she's special. Whereas if she goes back home, she wouldn't be. And so I feel like that almost, I don't know, it's kind of a caricature or a satire in some ways. And I actually had to work on, making her more of a real person as opposed to just this one kind of villain figure of this like white woman addicted to being told her Chinese is so good or that she is so beautiful, which, I think it's good to have Alva as a character remind the reader sometimes that a lot of these things are just kind of like etiquette or niceties that are being said and not necessarily reflect the fact that, like Sloane is truly this like goddess movie actress, but she starts thinking she is because of this, endless kind of attention and like kind of special status. And so, yeah, that's what I was attempting to do with her character. And I did also want to show that even though she wasn't a corporate expat, or she was truly kind of toiling away, and the character, and she's kind of breaking as the years goes on because her comparative advantage and specialness is decreasing every year as more and more foreigners are coming into China, younger foreigners are coming into China. She's no longer this kind of OG expat who came in the 80s. And I think, yeah, I'm curious to think if you kind of saw some of that satire come through of, yes, like a woman addicted to specialness who you can guess as a reader probably isn't all that special back in her home country.
Definitely was able to pick it
Yeah.
up. Yeah. Yeah. I was just like interested because I was like, would you consider her an expat or an immigrant? Because I just feel like she's like in the middle because she does toil away. Like you said, she's a single mother. She's not rich. And, it might not be perfect Chinese, but she actually knows the language and she's putting her kid through like Chinese public schools. I'm like, like, would she be an expat in like our definition of expats these days, or would she be an immigrant? So I thought that was like a fun experiment that you put in.
Yeah. And I kind of think as, all of us have international backgrounds, we kind of lived on both sides, like Eastern and Western. So I think when we run into someone like Sloane out like in the wild, our BS meter is kind of going off sometimes.
Yeah,
right?
especially the fact that like what is it?
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, a white woman is dating a Chinese man, where it's like they praise the Chinese man for finally like capturing like the white woman, but what if it's like the inverse, where it's like a Chinese woman with a white man? It's like, oh, you're a sellout, you're like a terrible human being, a race traitor. And I'm like, wow, okay, like that's not fun.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the many layers of these kind of gender and racial dynamics that I was trying to capture in the book that I observed growing up in Shanghai. I remember taxi drivers being one of the key demographic when I was growing up, who would ask, oh, like your mom, your dad, who's a foreigner? And when I said, oh, my dad's Chinese and my mom is a foreigner, they would say, oh yeah, your dad is so good, like so amazing. And I remember that so distinctly, being like, if it were the opposite, they probably wouldn't be doling out those compliments.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch a little bit about your other point of view character, Lu Fang, who is introduced to us as Alva's new stepfather at the top of the story. And, something interesting that we've been seeing a lot, and like we mentioned, we do read a lot of coming of age children of immigrant stories on this podcast, is we've been seeing them pay more attention to the stories of the parents as well as the kids, because we forget sometimes that, our parents are also fully fledged human beings with hopes and dreams, even before they had us, right? They're full people. And so Lu Fang's story is interesting because it follows him as he comes of age as well, during a very tumultuous time in Chinese history, right? He's introduced as like the brightest boy in his village, sent out to university and ready to rise above his station in this new China. And then while he's in the university, the Cultural Revolution happens, and almost overnight, his future is kind of taken away from him, right? He is forced to leave school. He's sent to a rural village for re-education. And as a result, when we see him again in the 80s, even though China is going through economic revitalization and growth thanks to opening its borders to trade again, he finds himself one step behind a lot of his younger peers who didn't have to go through what he went through and, have their futures intact. And his story is actually really common, right? Like there's a whole generation of people who lost their future during that time period. And I wanted to ask, like, can you talk to us about developing his coming of age story and how that was developed alongside Alva's own coming of age?
Yeah, I really wanted to kind of show this kind of inversion, to use that word again, of Alva's sense of self and sense of the world, in the sense that at first she sees Lu Fang as this kind of inconvenience in her life, or this minor character who's now playing an outsized role, and she just thinks of him as, you know, kind of a small parenthesis in her own existence that's unwelcome. And then when the reader, was, you know, dramatic irony, finds out that actually the opposite is true, in the sense that Alva's story is such a small parenthesis in this much broader, decade-spanning, complex kind of love-hate saga that is happening between Sloane and Lu Fang. So I really wanted to play with a sense of zooming in and out of, you know, time, but also this idea that the roles we play in each other's lives, when you kind of switch the timelines, everything is kind of shrinking and expanding in these hopefully interesting ways. And that's why, for me, it was important that Lu Fang's timeline kind of parallels the development of China in those decades that we follow him through. So, you know, we first find him shortly after the end of the Cultural Revolution, during the Reform and Opening era, where he's already kind of a bitter man and an old soul, even though he's not that old. He's in his 30s at the time, but he felt like so much has been cut short or denied to him. And yet there's this sense of possibility in the air, because the borders are open, trade is beginning to boom. You know, the world is coming in to China more and more, even if it's very difficult for him to get out without visa or connections and wealth. And then with his timeline, I really wanted to start kind of hopping through the decades at almost kind of this faster and faster space until the two timelines converge. And I treated some of his later sections almost like short stories, because the action needs to be very contained, because the next time we were going to see Lu Fang again, it was going to be, 10 years from then, or quite a long time. So there was the sense that the action cannot be quite so continuous. It needs to be self-contained. And that's how I came up with these kind of fun prompts for myself. Like, the 1994 section has to take place over the course of a weekend visit to Shanghai when the World Cup final is happening. Or this next section has to take place over the course of a few days over the Lunar New Year celebration. Or this next section has to take place over the course of a single taxi ride across Shanghai. And I feel like having those prompts in my head, and you can also tell that the prompts are like shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in terms of the time space they inhabit. And I think that allowed me to write his timeline as this kind of decade hopping, almost experiment. And I think also very deliberately, I wanted it to be a rags to riches kind of traditional story where you're like, oh, like, the fate is finally smiling upon him. But because we begin in the present timeline, we also have so many questions about, like, where are these people from his past? What happened? And this, I feel like in that sense, like the absence of people who you meet in the Lu Fang timeline become hopefully kind of a driving tension through the novel.
Yeah, and I love the fact that Lu Fang, like, he sees America as, like, a ticket to prosperity. And with Alva, she's pretty interesting with her relationship with America, because she's never been there. And, she romanticizes it. And I thought it was really interesting that these two characters who are from two generations, they have pretty much a similar romanticization of America. I'm not sure if America still has that image to other countries nowadays, but yeah, it did kind of like remind me of like the great American dream from an outsider's perspective. And it's just like, it was really interesting to see how those two characters kind of parallel each other in their desire to come to America.
Yeah, I think they call that soft power, right? America's soft power and like global culture.
I mean, with Hollywood, yeah. I mean, we're very good at propaganda and selling this lifestyle that, you know, like America is all glam, but there's a lot of.
I feel like for Alva, that kind of Hollywood soft power is definitely her catnip, and I wanted to be really careful when writing this book to not make it an assumption that America is actually better in all these XYZ ways, and that's why the characters want to go there. I also wanted to exaggerate the level of kind of illusion both of them have about the US. So for Alva, it's because, you know, she's like just binging on this American media diet where she thinks that being an American teenager is like the TV shows she's watching, you know, Gossip Girl, 90210, all those CW shows of that era. And she feels like she's being denied that version of an adolescence. But hopefully readers can pick up that her view of the US it's like the movie version of the US. You know, she watches at one point Thelma and Louise, and she's like, my mom comes from the country where everyone's wearing cowboy hats and cowboy boots. Like, I wanted to kind of dial up those details to kind of remind readers, no, she has a very kind of flat, illusionary view of the US. And I think for Lu Feng, similarly, he's, you know, doesn't really know much about the country, has never been there. It wasn't so much about what the, you know, concrete, real benefits of being in the US versus being in China, where it was more the sense that he wanted to be able to go see what's beyond. He wanted at least access to these opportunities and to, you know, step out of the constraints around him if he wanted to, but he cannot, or he was denied that, and he's more grading against the constraints around him rather than, you know, really idealizing the US as a country. And actually, this is a decision that my editor and I talk a lot about in revising, that we actually changed quite a few instances of America to just the West, to be like, it's not like country specific. Like, why does he want to go to the US and not to the UK? You know, it's just like, it's more about the ability to step out rather than idolizing a specific country.
As someone who is not Chinese and cannot read Chinese characters, I thought the way you wove Chinese pictograms into your narrative was really interesting, how it represented how Lu Feng felt in his life, felt trapped, and how there were just some characters where there were no translation at all. Like, you only got what you saw on the page. And the only way I like learned what those words were was through audiobook or looking them up somehow. So were there any concerns in the beginning when you were concerns about like visual storytelling not translating onto paper, not translating to non-Chinese readers?
That's such a good question, because I thought a lot about each choice, you know, when I would put a Chinese character on the page and not translate it. So, sometimes, you know, I would put a character and kind of explain the pictogram and kind of why it was there. And I think in this way, maybe some readers who don't speak or write Chinese at all might actually now be able to recognize a few of these characters just through the explanations. But I was actually really influenced by reading this novel called 99 Nights in Logar by Jamil John Kochai, where he it's also a coming of age story that takes place entirely in Afghanistan. And he pretty liberally uses some untranslated Pashto words. And even there's a whole chapter in Pashto that's not translated. And I thought that was a gutsy move. And I was kind of like, I want to do that too. And of course, it's in my book, I thought, okay, in some instances, readers can pick it up from context. In some instances, it's just like a small joke that Chinese readers might pick up on, but like it's okay if English speaking readers don't pick up on it. And there's one instance where I tried to do what Jamil did. It's much shorter. It's not a chapter, but Alva and Lufang basically recite 2 lines of the same poem together, and I do not translate that poetry. And for me, that was kind of a moment where I was like, it's a moment kind of between them. Or if you can read Chinese and read that line of poetry, it's also a moment between, all of you. But in some ways, it's okay that readers don't know what those lines translate to. It's almost like what's more important is that the 2 characters are sharing this moment with the poetry.
I did really love that scene. And, I can semi-read. I took like a couple years of Saturday school here in the States. So I know enough to like be able to interpret, because a lot of reading Chinese characters is not only knowing the characters, but also interpreting like the components of characters. But one thing that was missing from my Chinese education, was the poems, right? The proverbs. And so I thought that was a really cool way to show this like Chinese connection between the 2 characters.
I'm so glad you felt that way reading it.
Yeah. Well, your book has been out for a few weeks now. How has that been, having your debut out in the world and having people read it and have thoughts about it? Are you one of those authors who like don't read any reviews, or are you checking those?
I was checking them at first, I have to admit, because when you're kind of in this anticipatory period right before your book comes out, and I feel like even in the days right afterwards, I felt like I was like a monster hungry for like any bit of information, any kind of reaction I could get. And then at some point after the book was truly out in the world, and there were more Goodread reviews coming in and things like that, I had to stop myself from looking at them, because there was a sense of like overstimulation or a cacophony of all these different reactions. And I realized I need to kind of let go of the book and the story and have it be its own entity and interact with the readers. And if I'm the author just lurking, reading every comment on Goodreads, or every like Instagram comment section conversation about the book that I could find, it would actually start living in my brain and perhaps affecting how I think of the story now, or how I'm going to write the next book in a way that felt dangerous. So I think, of course, professional reviews, it's hard to not read them. Or when my friends, when people write me, specifically to tell me how they felt about the book, I always appreciate that. And especially hearing from Asian American or Asian diaspora readers, and readers who have grown up in Asia, or who are immigrants in the US and maybe didn't grow up in Asia, but they're seeing more about maybe their family, or understanding some stories through the book. That has been really, really hugely meaningful. So yeah, it's really meaningful to me to be able to reach more Asian American readers and Asian diaspora readers, because I feel like in some ways this is a book hugely about race and identity, even if it's in a slightly more non-traditional setting. So yeah, that's why I'm happy to also be on this podcast.
We're happy to have you. All right. Well, I guess that will bring our conversation to an end. Aube, thank you so much for joining us on Books and Boba. We're so glad to have you to talk about your debut. I'm sure you're busy with book tour and promoting, but gotta ask. Are you working on anything else now?
Yes, I have a few chapters of my next book, which actually will be set entirely in France, but with an Asian American protagonist. So once I'm done with the book tour travels, I look forward to crawling into a cave and starting work on this next book.
Are you allowed to give us like a teaser what it's about, or is it all like under wraps right now?
It takes place at a rural country house in Provence, and our Asian American protagonist is following her wealthy white boyfriend to their family house. And I call it a retelling of The Picture of Dorian Gray. There's some
oh my gosh,
surrealist elements to it. A lot of hedonism and the kind of David Lynchian darkness takes place, and there might be some mysterious mechanism at work, but we're never quite sure. But yes, so that's a few teasers for the premise of the story.
Amazing. Pre-ordering. Yes.
Well, good luck with that. Good luck with the new book. Good luck on the rest of your book tour. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us on Books and Boba.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Aube Lescure, the author of River East, River West, available now at booksellers everywhere, including the Books and Boba online bookstore. As always, if you purchase books from our online bookshop, you not only support the Books and Boba podcast, but also your local bookstore. So definitely check it out by going to booksandboba.com and clicking on our bookshop link. Before we go, Rira, can you remind us what we are reading for book club this month for January 2024?
Yeah, we are reading Meet Me Tonight in Atlantic City by Jane Wong, and it's a memoir about Jane Wong's experience growing up in a Chinese-American restaurant on the Jersey Shore. Trigger warnings for this book. It involves gambling addiction, so if that is something that you are triggered by, just proceed with caution.
Yeah, I'm almost through this book, and you can definitely tell Jane has a background in poetry because her passages are very, very poetic. But I'm looking forward to discussing this book with all of you at the end of the month. As always, if you've already finished the book and have thoughts to share, please let us know either on our Goodreads forums or our Discord server if you're a Patreon supporter. And with that, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to Aube Lescure for joining us to chat. And we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey, I'm Phil Yu, and you may know me from a blog called Angry Asian Man.
And I'm Jeff Yang, author, journalist, and celebrity dad.
We host a podcast called They Call Us Bruce, an unfiltered conversation about what's happening in Asian America.
Each week or so, we host a discussion about some of the most vital and interesting topics in our pop culture and our community, bringing in guests who are shaping and informing this thing called Asian America from Hollywood to DC and beyond.
We got media, entertainment, food, family, politics, representation.
The good, the bad, the WTF of it all.
So check us out wherever you get your podcasts or at theycallsbruce.com.
Peace.
Peace.